Today we are interviewing Cindy Adams, who has held the position of co-director of library services for the Atlanta law firm of McKenna Long Aldridge, LLP. Prior to that, Cindy worked as assistant corporate secretary for Illuminex Inc., and before that for Coca-Cola Enterprises, initially as assistant law librarian and later as a legal assistant. I note that Cindy began her career as a law librarian for a predecessor of her current law firm who employs her. Cindy, let's begin with a little personal history. Can you tell us where you were raised and about your family life, both when you were young and today?
Well, I grew up in Daytona Beach, Florida, which of course is an unusual place to be a young person, especially during race week when they bring in all the cars. And then of course there's the motorcycle week, which when I was younger I had a motorcycle because you could drive that at 15 instead of at 16, and it was cheaper. But my mother didn't let me go out during race week. So that was my growing up in Daytona Beach. I ended up going to the University of Florida for my undergraduate degree. And while I was there, I worked as a student assistant in the law library. And that's how my interest in law came about. But when I was younger, in elementary school, I was a helper in the library. And I loved the librarian. Her name was Beth Cleveland. She was a wonderful lady. And that was where my real love of being in the library, and I'm a first child, so I'm like so organized and kind of anal, and it just called to me. So that was my growing up, and now I've been happily married for 32 years, and I have two beautiful daughters. One is a student at Belmont University in Nashville, and the other is a senior at Woodward Academy here in Atlanta.
That all sounds very good, very wonderful. What about your education and your professional training? What degrees, for example, do you hold, and where did you go to college and then to library school?
Well, my undergraduate degree is in journalism from the University of Florida with a specialty in public relations. And it was there that I really focused on learning how to write well. It was a good school to go to. And as I mentioned, I worked in the law library at that time. And when I finished my degree, I was looking for a job because to become accepted in a public relations firm as an employee at that time, you had to have had an internship. Well, I put myself through school, so I had applied for many, many internships, but they were unpaid. And I couldn't afford to do that. So I got done with my degree. And I was kind of worried about where I was going to have a job to feed myself, and they had an opening at the law library for a technical assistant. So I worked at the law library, and I did document retrieval, copies. This was in the olden days when you had to send in a request, and we would copy the law review article for you and send it off to you in the mail. And I also was in charge of the filers, the loose leaf filers, who were student assistants, which is what I started out doing initially. And I remember there was one young man who came to work with us. He was a student, sent over by work study. And he came, and I'm training him on how to take the old pages out and put the new pages in, and you have to do it right. And he looked at me after about 15 minutes of training, and he said, "This is not the job for me." And he gathered up his stuff and left. I was like, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe it. But it was a really great experience working there. I had the benefit of getting to know Miss Betty Taylor, who was one of the founding icons of law librarianship with her vision of computerized legal research. She had the first West terminal. She had the first Lexis terminal. She was involved in the formation of Solinet. And she really had a vision of legal research that was, I think, unique. And she's one of the first women to be in such an exalted position within a university setting. So she was a great mentor. And also had the pleasure there of working with Pam Williams and Susie Gilman, who is now Susie Potter. all three of those women were very influential to me as I made the decision to go to library school. And then I came up to Emory to get my graduate degree. While I was here, I took a course in law librarianship from Ann Butler. And Ann was the very first law librarian in Atlanta. And I walked into the classroom, and here's this stunningly beautiful woman, and I thought, oh, she must be a fellow student. Well, it turned out she was the professor. And Ann was a force of nature in Atlanta. She was a very innovative person as well. So that kind of gives you a picture of my educational background. Yeah.
Well, you've talked about some of the people, including several luminaries in our field, with whom you were able to work at different points while you were coming up through the educational system. Did any of them particularly, or play any particular role in recruiting you into become a law librarian as opposed to perhaps some other type of librarian?
Well, I think that the influence of Betty Taylor, just the fact that being in the law library, you were hanging out with really smart people, and most of them were very pleasant people. You're around educated people, so that part of librarianship really appealed to me. And then with the introduction of the legal research that was electronic at the time, that was intriguing as well. But she was very encouraging of me going to library school, as was Pam, as was Susie. So yeah, all three of them played pretty significant roles. And when I got up here and met Ann, and I had not thought about going into a law firm library until I met Ann. And that was when it was like, oh my goodness, this is really where I need to be.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you sort of took that focus, because during that period, the law firms were expanding in their needs. And the needs for people with the kind of training we bring to the table became more and more obvious. So there was a tremendous growth in our profession. It sort of doubled in terms of size, I think, overall during those years, and it has maintained that much larger profile basically ever since.
Yeah, back then, I think there might have been 25 librarians that were members of the Atlanta Law Librarians Association, and it has grown geometrically. It's a really good organization that's part of AALL.
Yeah. I spent 30 years in D.C., and of course through the local chapter there, the Law Librarian Society, I got to know an awful lot of firm librarians, government librarians, and these were people that in jobs and positions that I really had known nothing about. Coming up as a law student and through the academic end. And it was very fascinating. And I have some interesting stories, but this isn't my interview, it's yours. So if I want more time, I have to go ask to be interviewed again, I guess. Let's move on now to your career in law librarianship. You began in the private law firm sector, moved into the corporate world, and then about 23 or 24 years ago, returned to the private sector. Could you describe some of the specific positions that you've held during your career, and talk a little bit about some of the things you accomplished when you were in them?
Well, when I came out of library school, I went to work for a firm in Atlanta called Jones, Bird & Howell. And it had about 40 attorneys, and the librarian was Jane Miller, who is now Jane Aronoff. Well, Jane hired me as a brand new librarian, and I'll never forget. I mean, I remember her showing me how to shepherdize through the little pamphlets. First you do the gold, then you do the red, then you do the little paper. And she was a huge, huge help to me in learning the legal research aspects. And I was hired on the day after Labor Day. And I went to work, and on that Friday they announced a merger with Alston, Miller & Gaines to become the law firm Alston & Bird. Well, I had taken the job at Jones, Bird & Howell because I really wanted to be in a smaller firm, and now I was going to be in this giant firm. And so I thought, I don't know that this is going to fit me real well. And there was an opening at Long, Aldrich, Heiner, Stevens & Sumner, which, I mean, now we're in these short names instead of everybody's name on the letterhead. And they had an opening, and I applied for it and ended up taking the job. And that was the predecessor firm to the firm that I'm with now. And what's been interesting is that so many of the summer associates that I dealt with during my 2.5 years tenure there are now these senior partners with the same firm. And so I've seen these people grow up from these young people now to these real grown-up people. It's been interesting. But while I was at Long Aldrich and Norman, I was looking around for something else to do. I thought, well, I don't know if I want to be here forever. And there was an opening at the Coca-Cola Company, and that appealed to me. So I applied for that and was luckily hired over there. And I worked in their law library for a couple years. And it was fascinating because in addition to doing the legal research, we had to help out on the business side, on the chemical side, so it was a broad spectrum. Advertising law, media law, all kinds of things. So it was a more generalized kind of education in research. And while I was there, the company decided to form Coca-Cola Enterprises. And overnight, they took a little tiny company and then combined all these companies together and formed Coca-Cola Enterprises. So it went from being nothing to being this $2 billion publicly held company overnight. And I was in the library, and they invited me to come and work with them at CCE. And I was going to be the assistant to the general counsel, the legal assistant. And that was one of the best moves I ever could have made, because there were 3 lawyers and 3 legal assistants for this giant company. And my responsibilities were to manage the litigation. So I got to work with the insurance people, and I got familiar with the court processes and how things really needed to work from the business side. I got to do securities law, and any deal that was $1 million or less was managed by a legal assistant, not by the lawyer. So I got really familiar with transactional work, and I got to do lots of securities filings. And those were the days when you actually went to the printer in New York and you worked all night at a big long conference table, and they brought you printed pages and took them away, and brought them and took them away. And I was there for 2.5 years, and I mean, we worked so hard. We would be at work at 8 in the morning, we wouldn't leave till 10 at night, but the learning curve was dramatic. And in addition to learning the legal side of things, I got exposed to a lot of the business aspects as well, because we were sent out to do due diligence at the different manufacturing facilities. So it was a really, really good move. While I was there, I was recruited by this company, Alumax, and what they were doing is moving their headquarters from San Francisco to Atlanta. And they recruited me as assistant corporate secretary, and they offered me a very nice salary increase, which was really, it was hard because I loved my job at CCE, but I couldn't turn the money down. So I ended up going to do that, and I was there for a couple years, and the work environment was not as wonderful as I had hoped it would be. And so I was recruited back to Long Aldrich. It was Long Aldrich at the time. And my boss, one of the attorneys, called me up and said, let's have lunch. I want you to come back and be our librarian. And I was like, I don't think I want to do that. And he came and he said, oh, let's just have lunch anyway. So we went and had lunch, and he said, I really want you to come back. Give me a list of what you want. And so I thought, well, okay. So I made a list, and I gave him the list, and he said yes to everything on that list. And I thought, I should have put down more stuff. Why didn't I ask for more? But I ended up going back to what is now McKenna, Long and Aldrich back in 1990. And it's been a great move. I mean, the firm's gone through some mergers. We've just grown, but it's a great, great place to work, and I love my job. I have the best library team. I just love my staff. So that's a little bit of my work history.
Well, that sounds all very interesting, and the opportunity to sit down with someone who's going to be one of your bosses and basically get asked, what do you need? And then you get it. Is something that more of us would love to have gone through.
Once in a lifetime experience.
I was able to ask for a lot of stuff, but it wasn't always just we can afford it. It came back. Oh. Cindy, you've been a member of AALL for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
I don't dare say how many years, because we may both be showing our point in this thing. But you've also been a member and leader in the Atlanta Law Library Association. But today, actually, I would like to focus on your membership and involvement in the Special Libraries Association. This is because SLA, usually through its legal division, actually attracts quite a few of our colleagues from law libraries, and has put together a program series of things they can do for them that apparently meets a very real need. In fact, I know that one of my former direct colleagues, Lolly Gauslaway, she and I, when we were first newly minted, worked together at the University of Houston. And some years later, she not only rose to the top ranks in ALL, but also rose to the top ranks in SLA. She had a very active involvement there, and is a recipient of the John Cotton Dana Award at this point. She also, on the law ALL side, has the Gallagher Award as well.
Yeah.
Lolly has done it all very well for everybody, and that's wonderful. But the focus is not so much about Lolly or ALL today. I want to talk a little bit about what SLA means to you and to many of our colleagues, and some of the things that that they do that are worthwhile.
Let me give you a little bit of the history as I experienced it. Quite a few years ago, I want to say it was 17 years ago, 18 years ago, Barbara Silversack, who's a librarian, I think her firm is Thompson Hine in Ohio, she and I were having conversations about that our educational needs were not being met as law firm librarians by the programming that was available at AALL. And we had both heard about SLA, and I went and I attended one of their conferences, and it was just an eye-opener for me because I was meeting librarians from museums and corporate settings and places you never even knew they had librarians. And for a law firm librarian, that was a really positive step because we needed to know more about the business aspects than we did about the academic aspects of just business itself. And the exposure to these other kinds of librarians and the networking that you could do with them, it was huge. Well, Barbara had the idea of forming a law librarians division. And there were a couple other ladies involved who I'm sorry to say I can't remember their names. But that thought was directly because the programming wasn't what we needed at the time. And so the division was formed, and within, I think, 10 years, it was the second biggest division next to the business and finance division as part of SLA. So there was clearly a need for that kind of programming. What's been interesting to me is that, you know, this migration kind of took place, and there were people that had memberships in both, but lots of people couldn't afford to maintain memberships in both. And the firms would not pay for you to go to two conferences, so you had to pick. So I can understand a little bit of that sort of concern on the part of AALL. And I think that, I know that AALL, you know, started with the academic community, and I think that really is more their focus. You know, it's very difficult for law firm librarians to have the time to serve in leadership positions. It's just hard. Especially, I mean, I was thinking about this the other day that our profession is primarily women. And if you're working full-time and you have a family, it is really difficult to find the time for other service opportunities. And so I think that's where, you know, law firm librarians kind of just didn't have the opportunities to serve, and therefore the control of the organization was more in the academic side because they had the ability and the time. But at this point in time, thanks to Kate Martin, who I worked with and who is just a wonderful, wonderful person, when she created the PLL Summit, that, I think, answers the needs of the law firm librarians, because you have to have that time in small group to address concerns that are particular to law firms, which more and more, law firms are businesses, totally businesses. We don't have, everything has to have a business case made for it. What are the financial benefits? What are the time benefits? So we're having to become more and more and more business managers rather than just researchers or you know, help with the print materials and the online materials. So that's where I kind of see there is a tension between the two organizations, and I think there's a place for both of them, because particularly for law librarians who are inside corporations, you need the SLA because of the networking that it gives you. That's not to say, I mean, some of the programs that are at AALL are very valuable to law firm librarians. But the business focus is where I think that it just kind of, the tension occurred.
Well, I was sort of part of it when I was in the leadership of AALL. We saw a lot of this, and my own sense was that a little competition is not a bad thing, frankly. And I worked with Kate, too. Kate Martin, you mentioned. In fact, I get to interview her in a few days.
Oh, that's so great.
On this same trip. I'm going to stop up in Rockville, Maryland, and visit her library at the courthouse now, and interview not only Kate, but 5 other colleagues who are good friends of mine up in the D.C. area.
That is so great.
And so I'm having a fabulous time going around doing this sort of thing, as you can obviously tell. But Kate, I worked with her on numerous occasions with the Law Librarian Society in Washington, D.C. And I was impressed that she was such a doer of things. And we had a number of other firm librarians who were very active in that group. And I think many of them have contributed to some of the programming, both at ALL that more reflects the needs of the firm colleagues, and also at SLA.
Well, Kate, when she had that idea for the summit, I'll never forget, she called me up, I was at home, I'm getting supper ready, and we were on the phone for an hour and a half. My family's like, is dinner coming? I'm like, no, I'll get to it. Have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But she and I were on the phone, and when she gets an idea, you can't stop her. She is just an amazing person, and that summit is just a huge testament to her energy and her drive.
I imagine it would be. I was involved with her on another one of her brainstorm ideas, and that was to put on what amounted to a mini version of an annual conference when the Law Librarian Society in D.C. hit its 50th anniversary back about more years back than I want to remember at this point. And she was basically our organizer and primary chair, and it was very interesting. It was a very successful endeavor, I thought. We had a few growing pains. The hotel did some remodeling of part of our facility while we were there, but you know, you live and learn. And but it was a wonderful opportunity. She is certainly a real dynamo.
Yes,
to say
if
the
she
very
puts
least.
her hand to it, it's going to happen.
Yes. Well, it sounds like you've had the opportunity to work with her very much as well.
Oh yeah, well she was our director of libraries in Washington, and I reported to her. And when she decided to leave and go to the county library, that's when my colleague in California, Jody Kelly, and I became co-directors. And I take care of the East Coast, and Jody takes care of
Yeah,
the
I
West
noticed
Coast.
the title, and I couldn't figure out who else here in this office was the other co-director. But
Yep.
now you have explained.
Yeah, well, you
the
know,
choice.
Kate was able to do both coasts, but Jody and I needed to split up the jobs. So, and it worked out well because we've since had a merger, so there's more than enough work for both of us.
It does seem that the law firms, some of them are getting considerably larger than they once were. You know,
Yep.
so much for a big firm being 50 lawyers now.
Oh, no, mm-mm.
Cindy, while many or even most of our viewers are familiar with the Special Libraries Association, they may not really, or at least until today's interview, have been aware of why so many law librarians were attracted to it. I think you have basically laid that out and done it very well.
Thank you.
And programming is, and justification is the name of the game we all go through. And to have some of the opportunities, SLA is, I think in terms of size, about twice the size of ALL. So
it's very
it brings
large, yeah.
librarians who have apparently similar needs to our firm colleagues, but come from other libraries. So it must be very interesting, as you said, to work with them and get to take advantage of their expertise as well.
Well, I remember one of the first conferences I went to, I got to meet the librarian from Ocean Spray. Who knew, you know? And it was one of those chance meetings, and some of the museum librarians, it just, and the networking is just huge, because you never know, as you understand, when you're in a law firm library, you never know what your question's going to be. You know, we had one question years ago about a device called a plethysmograph. And I'm not going to explain what it is, but we didn't even know how to spell it. And it ended up being, I'll never forget that request. That was 100 years ago. But it's that you never know what's around the corner. It's something that I love about the work. Absolutely.
Well, I've heard similar stories throughout several of
I
these
bet you
interviews.
have.
One, I'll tell out one tale. Penny Hazelton, who's now at the University of Washington, was interviewed, and she, at one point in her career, was the librarian at the U.S. Supreme Court. And they had a question come up about the direction, I think it was some river flowed, whether it went into the Midwest or the Pacific drainage basin in the Rockies for the water. And somehow she was on the phone and got to talking to a geologist, I think is how she described it, who was literally standing on the Continental Divide, and he gave her the answer.
You never know who you're going to be on that phone with.
Absolutely not. As you say, we never know what the next reference question is going to be or how we'll respond until it comes, and then we do.
Yep. Yep.
Well, I want to thank you, Cindy Adams, for allowing us to visit with you today and for taking these few moments to share so much about yourself and about our profession. Before closing, however, is there anything you would like to add before we conclude the interview?
I would just say that this job has been the best one that I could have ever found. It fit me to a T. And anyone who's interested in being a law librarian, either in the academic setting or in the private firm setting or in the court setting, you couldn't ask for a better job. I love it.
Again, thank you, Cindy.
Thank you. It's been lovely.
Thanks.